In January 2014, a biologist named Igor Penido waded into the murky shallows of Lagoa de Pampulha, an artificial lake in downtown Belo Horizonte, Brazil. The lake sits in the middle of the third largest urban sprawl in the country. Nearly 6 million people live within a few kilometers of its banks. For decades, scientists had written off this body of water as biologically degraded beyond meaningful recovery. Raw sewage from surrounding neighborhoods drained directly into it. Heavy metals from upstream mining settled into its sediment. On certain days, the stench alone kept joggers off the surrounding paths. Penido was conducting a routine fish survey, part of a long-running monitoring effort by the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He pulled a net through the silted bottom and found a brown, armored catfish clinging to the mesh. It was a cascudo, a type of suckermouth catfish covered in bony plates, and at first it looked unremarkable. But back in the lab, when Penido examined the specimen under magnification, something did not add up. The tooth shape was wrong for any known local species. The dorsal fin carried a blue-tan coloration that matched no catalogued fish in the basin. He contacted Claudio Zawadzki, a leading taxonomist at the State University of Maringá, and together they compared the specimen to a 160-year-old drawing. It was an exact match. The fish was Hypostomus subcarinatus, a species first described by the French naturalist Francis de Castelnau in 1855. No scientist had positively identified it since. For over 160 years, the species had been considered either misclassified, vanishingly rare, or extinct. And here it was, alive, in one of the most polluted urban lakes in South America. This is the story of how a dead river running through the heart of Brazil came back to life, and how the first creature to announce the recovery was one that nobody expected and almost nobody recognized. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. The Rio das Velhas is the longest tributary of the São Francisco River, one of the most important waterways in Brazil. It stretches 801 kilometers from its source at the Andorinhas waterfall near the historic city of Ouro Preto, winding north through the highlands of Minas Gerais, before emptying into the São Francisco at a place called Barra do Guaicuí. The indigenous Tupi people called it Uaimii. In their language, that meant Old River. The Portuguese colonizers who followed renamed it Rio das Velhas, the River of the Old Women, after a story about 3 elderly indigenous women found on its banks by gold prospectors in the 17th century. For centuries, this river was the central artery of life in Minas Gerais. It carried gold during the Brazilian gold rush. It fed communities that grew up along its course. More than 170 fish species were estimated to inhabit the broader São Francisco basin, and the Velhas was one of its richest tributaries. Researchers Carlos Bernardo Mascarenhas Alves and Paulo dos Santos Pompeu, both from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, documented over 100 fish species in the Velhas Basin alone during surveys conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Among them was the dorado, Salmonus franciscanus, a large, powerful, golden-scaled predator that needs exceptionally high dissolved oxygen levels to survive. The dorado was the apex indicator of a healthy river. Then came the city. Belo Horizonte, founded in 1897 as the planned capital of Minas Gerais, grew explosively through the 20th century. By the 1990s, its metropolitan region was home to more than 5 million people spread across 34 municipalities. The city sits directly on the upper course of the Velhas. 2 of the river's most important tributaries, the Ribeirão Arrudas and the Ribeirão do Onça, flow through the densest urban zones of the capital. And for decades, nearly all the sewage produced by those millions of people was dumped directly into these streams, with no treatment whatsoever. The effect was catastrophic. Over a stretch of roughly 130 kilometers, approximately 80 miles, the Rio das Velhas became biologically dead. Dissolved oxygen levels dropped to near zero. The water turned black and foul. Fish populations collapsed entirely in the metropolitan reach. Monitoring surveys conducted in the 1990s found that fish simply did not approach the Belo Horizonte metropolitan area. The water downstream of the city was classified as Class 4, the worst designation under Brazil's national water quality standards. Marcos Polignano, a public health doctor and professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, described it plainly. He said it was not a river, it was a sewer. Meanwhile, upstream, the headwaters were being hammered by a different force. The Iron Quadrangle, one of the most mineral-rich regions on Earth, surrounds the Upper Velhas. Iron ore mining stripped vegetation, destabilized hillsides, and sent massive loads of sediment into the river's source waters. What mining did not destroy, deforestation for cattle ranching finished. The combination of urban sewage from below and mining sedimentation from above created an 80-mile corridor of ecological collapse. An entire generation grew up in Belo Horizonte without ever seeing a living fish in their river. Here's the key insight that changed everything. It did not come from an ecologist, it came from a doctor. In the early 1990s, Apolo Heringa Lisboa was a physician and professor at the medical school of the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He had spent years studying the connections between disease prevalence and environmental conditions in the communities around Belo Horizonte. One night he joined residents of a rural community called Ries on a fishing trip along a clean stretch of the Velhas, far from the city. The fishers used harpoons and a powerful spotlight that illuminated the water from above. When the light hit the surface, Heringa saw thousands of fish moving below, filling the river like a living carpet. He later recalled that in that moment, he understood what health actually meant, not the absence of disease, not a prescription, a clean river full of fish. That experience crystallized an idea that would reshape water policy in Minas Gerais. Heringa argued that public health and river health were not separate problems. They were the same problem. If the rivers were poisoned, the communities along them would be sick. If you could bring the fish back, it would mean the water was clean enough to sustain life at every level. In 1997, Heringa founded the Manuelsau project at the university. The name came from a beloved character in the fiction of Guimarães Rosa, one of the most important Brazilian novelists of the 20th century. The real Manuelsau was Manuel Nardi, a cowboy from Minas Gerais who lived his entire life in harmony with the land and the rivers. The project's goal sounded almost absurdly ambitious: bring the fish back to the Rio das Velhas, not to a remote tributary, to the metropolitan stretch, to the 80 miles that everyone had written off as permanently dead. The skepticism was immediate. Engineers pointed out that the volume of untreated sewage entering the river was staggering. Environmentalists argued that mining contamination in the headwaters made any downstream recovery meaningless. Politicians saw it as a generational problem, too large and too expensive for any single administration to take on. But Heringa was not proposing a traditional environmental campaign. He was proposing a public health intervention, and that reframing changed who paid attention. The Manuelsau team began with data. Starting in 1999, biologists from the project launched a systematic monitoring program across the basin, surveying fish populations, measuring dissolved oxygen, cataloguing aquatic invertebrates, and mapping where life still existed and where it did not. The results confirmed what everyone suspected, but nobody had quantified so precisely. Roughly 80% of the river's pollution was generated within the Belo Horizonte metropolitan area, which occupied only 10% of the basin's total territory. Polignano later explained the strategic insight. If you concentrate all policy, resources, and economic effort on that specific stretch, you effectively address the crisis for the entire river. In 2001, the first major intervention began. The Rio das sewage treatment plant, built by the Minas Gerais Sanitation Company, known by its Portuguese acronym COPASA, began processing raw sewage from one of the most polluted tributaries in the basin. The plant used a combination of anaerobic reactors and biological filtration to break down organic waste before returning the water to the river. It was not glamorous work. It involved concrete pipes, settling tanks, and the unglamorous engineering of processing human waste at industrial scale. But it was the first time in the history of the metropolitan region that a significant volume of sewage was being treated before it entered the Velhas. In 2004, Heringa and the Manuelsau team launched an initiative they called Goal 2010. It was a public policy proposal with 3 specific targets. By 2010, people should be able to navigate, fish, and swim in the Rio das Velhas within the metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte. The state government adopted it, and in 2006, a second, even larger sewage treatment plant came online. The Onça treatment facility, located near the border of Belo Horizonte and Santa Luzia, was designed to handle sewage for 1.5 million residents. Its first phase processed 1.8 cubic meters per second. A second expansion in 2010 doubled that capacity. The numbers shifted dramatically. In 2003, Capasa treated 41 million cubic meters of sewage across the basin. By 2008, that figure had more than doubled to 85 million cubic meters. By 2010, it reached 127 million cubic meters. Let me put that in context. In 7 years, the volume of treated sewage tripled. Millions of cubic meters of raw waste that would have flowed directly into the river were instead being processed, filtered, and returned as water that could support life. Scientists expected modest improvement. The models predicted slow, incremental recovery, possibly measurable over decades. What they found was something else entirely. Carlos Mascarenhas, a biologist at the Manuel Zao project and coordinator of New Velas, the project's transdisciplinary research center, had been watching the monitoring data for years. He noticed it first in the fish surveys. Species that had previously been recorded only in the healthier downstream stretches of the basin began appearing closer to Belo Horizonte, then closer still, then in locations where no fish had been documented for a generation. The fauna changed as water quality improved, he explained. Fish that used to only be found farther downstream in the basin began to appear near the city. But here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation. The first signs of recovery were not the charismatic species. They were not the golden dorado that everyone was watching for. The first creatures to recolonize the recovering stretches were the ones nobody was paying attention to: macroinvertebrates, tiny larvae of mayflies and caddisflies, freshwater shrimp, aquatic worms that could tolerate marginal oxygen levels. These organisms are not photogenic. They do not make headlines, but they are the foundation of an aquatic food web. Without them, nothing else can survive. Their return meant the river was building a biological floor, a base layer of life that larger species would eventually depend on. And then came the cascudo. The rediscovery of Hypostomus subcarinatus in Lagoa da Pampulha in 2014 was one of the most improbable findings in Brazilian ichthyology in decades. This was a fish described by Castelnau from a vague locality listed simply as streams from the province of Minas. No scientist had confirmed its existence since the original description. Some taxonomists believed the species designation was an error. Others assumed it had gone extinct before the 20th century even began. Claudio Zawadzki and Igor Pinedo published their redescription in 2019, confirming that the fish matched the original 1855 holotype, held in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. They noted that the rediscovery was an unexpected event, given the degraded condition of the lake. The data refused to fit the models. Researchers at the Federal University of Minas Gerais had documented that approximately 75% of all fish species known from the Velhas Basin still survived in healthy tributaries that connected to the main river. Because the Velhas has no dams between its course and the São Francisco River, there were no migration barriers. Fish could move freely between clean tributaries and the recovering main channel. This connectivity became the engine of recovery. As dissolved oxygen climbed in the treated stretches, species began migrating back upstream from refugia they had occupied for decades. The system was rebuilding itself. Not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly then suddenly, the cascade effect was textbook. As macroinvertebrates returned, small forage fish followed. As small fish populations grew, mid-level predators reappeared. As water clarity improved, submerged aquatic vegetation began to establish in the chateaux. The vegetation stabilized sediment, which further improved clarity, which allowed more light to penetrate, which fed more photosynthesis, which produced more dissolved oxygen. Each recovery triggered the next. Algae fed invertebrates. Invertebrates fed small fish. Small fish fed larger fish. The food web reassembled itself link by link, following a logic that no engineer designed and no model predicted at that speed. And the cost comparison is staggering. A conventional water treatment system, capable of processing the volume handled by the Arudas and Onça plants, would require continuous electricity, chemical inputs, and permanent staffing. The plants themselves cost hundreds of millions of reais, but the biological recovery they triggered was free. Every fish that returned, every invertebrate colony that established, every meter of aquatic vegetation that rooted in the riverbed was performing water filtration, nutrient cycling, and sediment stabilization at no additional cost. Nature was doing work that would have cost billions to replicate with infrastructure alone. This is not romantic nature worship. This is hard-nosed economics. But goal 2010 was not fully achieved, and this matters. By 2010, fish had returned to stretches of the river that had been lifeless for decades. Navigation was improving, but swimming in the metropolitan area was still not safe. The sewage treatment plants had removed the worst of the organic pollution, but bacteria levels remained too high for safe human contact. The treatment technology in place was designed to remove organic waste. It was not designed to remove pathogens. Achieving swimmable water would require a higher level of treatment, and that would cost significantly more money. There is a real human cost embedded in this story that the recovery data does not capture. For decades, communities along the Velhas depended on the river for subsistence fishing, irrigation, and livestock water. When the river died, those communities lost a resource they had relied on for generations. When the recovery began, it brought hope, but it did not immediately restore livelihoods. You cannot eat a fish from a river that is still classified as Class 4 pure, even if the fish have technically returned. The gap between ecological improvement and practical usability remains wide, and the people living along the riverbanks feel that gap most acutely. The fishing communities of the lower Velhas have watched the project with a mixture of hope and frustration. They want to fish again. Some of them remember when their grandparents pulled dorado from these waters, but they also know that the headwaters remain compromised by iron ore mining in the Iron Quadrangle, that invasive species have established themselves in several tributaries, and that the political will to fund the next phase of treatment is uncertain. The Manuel Zhao project launched Goal 2034 in partnership with the state government to push toward Class 2 water quality across the entire basin. Class 2 means the water would be suitable for fishing, navigation, and human consumption after conventional treatment. But that goal requires sustained investment over the next decade, and Brazilian environmental policy has not always been consistent across administrations. Polignano acknowledges this tension directly. He has described 2034 as a decisive year for these policies to be effectively implemented. The new Brazilian National Sanitation Framework, enacted in 2020, mandates that 90% of the population must have access to sewage collection and treatment by 2033. The Velhas project is now a test case for whether that law can be fulfilled in practice. Here is what stayed with me. There is an expedition that the Manuel Zhao team runs periodically called Rio das Velhas, Te Quero Vivo. It translates roughly to River of the Old Women, I Want You Alive. Teams of biologists, geographers, and engineers paddle kayaks from the headwaters near Ouro Preto through the metropolitan area and beyond, documenting conditions along the way. On recent expeditions, they have photographed stretches of the upper river where the water runs clear enough to see the bottom, where fish hold in the current behind submerged boulders, where riparian vegetation has begun to reclaim the banks. These are the same stretches that, 20 years ago, ran black with sewage and carried the smell of decay for kilometers. And somewhere in the murky waters of Lagoa da Pampulha, a fish that was described from a hand-drawn illustration in 1855 is still there, clinging to the bottom with its suckermouth, armoured in bony plates. Surviving in one of the most unlikely places on Earth for a species that was supposed to be gone forever. Nobody connected it to the sewage plants. Nobody connected it to the policy decisions. But the cascudo does not care about policy. It cares about dissolved oxygen and substrate and temperature. When those conditions shifted even slightly, even in a polluted urban lake surrounded by 6 million people, the cascudo did what life does. It persisted, it held on, and when the water got a fraction cleaner, it began to recover. The models were wrong about the timeline. The engineers were wrong about what would return first. And the river, the old river, the one the Tupi called Uaimi and the colonists called Das Velhas, is proving that 500 miles of watershed can be reconnected from within, one treatment plant and one returning species at a time. Most people in Brazil have never heard this story. Most people outside Brazil have no idea it is happening. But it is happening, and it is far from over. I want to know what surprised you most about this story. Was it the fish that came back after 160 years? The The doctor who started a referetation from a medical school? Or the fact that tripling sewage treatment triggered a cascade that no model predicted? Tell me in the comments. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.